We are delighted to host Alyssa Mastromonaco here at PNP. I think 99.99% of you know that she's was a senior member of the Obama administration in the West Wing of the White House. Of course, now she has a new title, author. Her new book is called Who Thought This Was a Good Idea and Other Questions You Should Have Answers to When You Work in the White House. You may know, and certainly when you read the book you'll know, she didn't start out as a political junkie. She didn't have aspirations of planning and managing the President of the United States' days in life and operations. But she got the bug in college, switched her major to political science, and then ran through a few non-political jobs before she got hired on Capitol Hill. She also had interned with Bernie Sanders, worked for Rick Boucher and John Kerry, and then, of course, became part of Barack Obama's original Senate team, worked on his 2008 campaign, and accompanied him to the White House in 2009. How many people here have worked with Alyssa in the White House? Oh, come on. I think you're lying. There's got to be more than that. Okay. In any case, she became the youngest woman to serve as Deputy Chief of Staff. She held that position from 2011 to 2014. Today, she's president at A&E Networks and a contributing editor to Marie Claire magazine. So this is a very funny and fun book. And when you read it, you will realize how helpful it is to have a sense of humor if you work in the White House. But it does have a serious subtext. She gives a really realistic and unvarnished view of what life is like behind the scenes if you're a presidential senior staff member. She has great stories. She has great advice. The book is indeed a primer of sorts for young people interested in politics, and so I think anybody you know who is interested should read it. Interested in having a career in government should read it. Alyssa's journey and experiences were particularly interesting to me. I think some of you who are regulars here at the store know I was on a previous president's staff, Bill Clinton's. And I just want to say, and of course this is a little bit of a spoiler alert, but whatever. When I was there were no tampon dispensers in the bathrooms in the West Wing.
Terrible.
But more relevant, we weren't smart enough to ask for them like you did. So. But she is smarter than we were back in the day, and she did ask. And so from now on, any woman who works in the White House and works for a president knows who to thank for that particular modernization. Along with a few other marks of progress that Alyssa helped usher along. So congratulations, you are now officially an author. You could also definitely be a stand-up comedian.
Oh, wow.
And I think we may need you in
I've
all
got
of
a
those
future.
roles moving forward. We're also delighted that Alyssa will be in conversation today with two of her pals, Annie Karni, who covers the White House for Politico and has reported as well for the New York Daily News, the New York Post, and the New York Sun, and Audrey Gelman, who has also dipped more than a toe into politics over the years, but most recently has worked as a public relations consultant. And we're just glad you're all here today, so thanks for being with us.
Hi, so I just want to say a quick thing. One, thanks everybody for coming, but then also thank you to Annie for coming and my good friend Audrey. Something I think that after the 2016 election, sorry, I forgot the year, that I think has become so important is a sense of community, and I am so proud of Audrey because she has helped create that sense of community with her all-women's social club called The Wing in New York City, which is the best place to be, and I wanted her to come to DC because she's opening 2 here in DC soon, so follow her on Instagram because it's one of the best things that's happened to me, so I know you'll enjoy it.
Thank you, Alyssa.
You're welcome.
Back to you.
Annie, kick it off.
Okay, I'll start it off. Alyssa covered some of it, but in the book, you write that, Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations is not the kind of job title that little girls dream of becoming.
Correct.
And that you also describe yourself as, like, you didn't really have a plan ever in life, it seemed.
No.
You kind of just one thing led to another.
Mm-hmm.
So, but you ended up being with this hugely important job for Barack Obama when you were 32 years old. So just, can you give us a short version of, like, how you ended up
How I ended up there?
Yeah.
How did I end up there? I think that for the most part, I just always sort of trusted my gut and assumed that because my parents, success for my family was just being able to pay your bills, and there wasn't really much more sort of stress put on me than that. And so I felt like I could try things out. Even in college, I never really didn't do great, but it was because I took a lot of courses that were hard and weird, and like Japanese I took for several years, and rural sociology and things like that weren't necessarily core to my major, but I thought would make me an interesting person, and it turns out that it does. And so when I sort of got into politics was Bernie Sanders when I was up in Vermont, and it totally
His
changed.
driver.
I drove him around sometimes.
Seems like a very, you really get to know him.
We had a lot of, it was really funny because he is exactly in person as he is on TV. Like, he wasn't giving me hugs and kisses. But we would like listen to NPR and drive around Vermont, and I didn't have air conditioning in my car, so the windows were just always down, and Bernie's hair was like all over the place. But he would ask me about my life and sort of quiz me on current events and talk to me about what was happening, because he was always reading the paper. And I realized in that internship that it wasn't necessarily politics that drew me in. I really liked the public servant element of it. I loved that someone could call up the office and have a problem and we could solve it. And so that sort of, forever corrupted me, and I was totally done. And then I didn't get a job out of college in politics. And so I had sort of this circuitous path until I ended up in the John Kerry Boston Senate office. Hi, Roger Fisk, who interviewed me many years ago. And I just decided it's like, life is short, you should do what you want. And so I did it, and I basically applied to be an intern, but I got a really sort of really low paying job, like so low that they offered me $20,500, and they said it 3 times to make sure that I didn't think it was $25,000, that it was 20,5. And so, and then I just sort of kept it up. At that point, I was sort of on the trajectory, and I stayed with JK, and he ran for president and lost, and then I met Barack Obama, and the rest is history.
You were in on the ground floor with Obama.
Ground floor. He was still wearing black mock turtlenecks. Mel remembers.
So I don't want to skip ahead too much, but one of the things I loved so much about the book, and I really encourage everyone here to buy a copy, is just like the voice. It is really your voice. Like, as somebody who knows you really well, it's so rare, I think, that somebody's voice and sense of humor and personality translates so well into the page.
Yes.
And so one of my favorite anecdotes, stories in the book is your trip to Buckingham Palace.
Yes.
And I wondered if maybe you could tell the audience sort of in your own words about
in my own words,
storied trip.
So when I was growing up, my Oma, it's German for grandmother, she spoke English, but not really. She preferred German, and so she would get these German tabloids delivered to the house, and they always had the royals in them. And so I became obsessed with Buckingham and the royals, and like all the royals in Europe, basically, but really in Buckingham. And so we were going to celebrate the Queen's Jubilee, which is the 60th anniversary of the Queen being on the throne. And it was a big affair. And the President and First Lady were going to honor her. And there was a dinner at Buckingham Palace, and then we were hosting the Queen at Winfield House, which is the residence of the U.S. ambassador to the U.K. at the time. It was Lou Sussman. And so I went a couple days in advance, not because I really had to, but because I needed to be amazing for the Queen. And so the party that we set up at Winfield House was my opportunity to meet the Queen. And she was like amazing. She had her tiara on and this like very swank like sequin dress. I mean, she was like everything you wanted her to be. But I had a cold, and I took British cold medicine, which is way better than what we have here. And I might have had a couple glasses of champagne, so that when we were standing around talking, I didn't embarrass anyone but myself, so that's all that matters. But when we were standing around talking, Colin Firth was there. And I don't know if Valerie Jarrett's here, but she was standing. She was my witness that the King's Speech had just come out. And yes, and so everyone was talking about their favorite Colin Firth movies, and I said mine was Love Actually, in front of David Beckham, his wife Nigella Lawson, and within earshot of David Beckham. And I said I actually love Love Actually, and in my enthusiasm, I recreated a scene from Love Actually. And I said, no, I love it. I love Love Actually. I love Uncle Jamie. I hate Uncle Jamie. And so I did that to Colin Firth, who did not, he was not super amused by it. But David Beckham was. was like literally the best day of my life. But then the president and the first lady knew how much I loved the royals. And so the next day when we were getting ready to leave London, we were all packed up and ready to go. And normally if you're not going with the president and first lady on Marine One, you go on the buses, you can basically wear whatever you want, you get on the back of the plane and you're done. So that's what I was prepared for. Only Barack Obama wanted to do me a huge solid, and so he sent Reggie Love to say, hey, boss wants you on Marine One out of Buckingham. And I was like, no, I'm in jeans. And he said, I don't care. You can tell him that. I mean, I'm not telling him that. And so anyway, I had to go to Buckingham in jeans, and I stood in the drawing room, I stood behind the couch and like thumbed through magazines. And then when it was time to go, I was begging the valets that would travel with us to like let me take the suitcases so that no one would see I was in jeans. And they were like, absolutely not. So we walk out and I turn around and like the whole house staff and the queen and the prince are like waving at us. And then I get on Marine One and the president turns around and he looks at me and he goes, jeans, Alyssa. And he just shook his head, but then he did a double take and he's like, what's in your hand? And I looked down and I had accidentally stolen a Tatler magazine from Buckingham, which Tatler magazine thinks is super hilarious, and they've been tweeting at me because they're like, no, it's real. She stole a Tatler from Buckingham. So that was my story. And from that point on, I always kept a pair of proper slacks in my carry-on.
It's a good takeaway lesson.
It's a takeaway.
This so this is like one theme of the book, that it's like your life in the White House was like a mixture of fabulous events and celebrities and like complete drudgery and having no life and actually isolating yourself because you were scared to go out because people would ask you if Barack Obama quit smoking.
Yep.
And you didn't. Did he?
Yeah, he did. But I'd be so emphatic about it. They'd be like, okay.
But like then you go to state dinners, and we were just talking before, we were interested in states. But first of all, like, why do you go to state dinners? And like, why do staffers go? How do you get to go? And like, you talk about prepping for like the world leader you might have to sit next to.
Yes.
So can you just tell, like, what are some go-to questions, and how does one get invited to a state dinner?
So usually, if you are attending a state dinner in a foreign country, the reason that you attend is like they really need bodies. Like they need people from America to like be in the event, and so you usually end up sitting with your counterpart, or it's like if their deputy chief of operations is going, then I would go, or like just their deputy chief. But the first lady felt very strongly that we all be prepared, because her point was that state dinners were not a party for us, they were work. And so, and I'm not speaking out of school, I don't think, and Mel's here, so she can check me if I'm wrong, but I would, when I knew that we were going, so like when we were going to Chile and there was going to be a state dinner, I would read up on like the Chilean news to see what was happening, so I didn't look like a dipshit in front of, like everyone at the table. Like I didn't want to think there'd been some flood downstate, and like I was just like, how's everything going? And then I also found that like tourism was a good thing to talk about in any country, talking about like what's interesting and what people come there to see, and just being really inquisitive and asking questions. And so I had a lot of good conversation about the fjords in Chile. Bet you didn't know there were fjords in Chile, and that they consider their salmon to be better than that of Norway. But the first lady was very much like, she would look around at the state dinner to make sure that we were all engaging. And I led the conga line in Tanzania. And she just looked at me and she's like, that's right. And the boys were not always as engaged as we were, so it was a good way to like make FLOTUS like you.
One of the things that I definitely noticed as a theme was just like the amount of sort of physical stress that you were under. So like there, you kind of casually, in your way, casually throw out there like, I woke up and my gums were bleeding.
They were.
NBD, or like my hair turned white. You talk a lot about just like, major physical changes and sort of strain that you were put through from having such a demanding job. And my question is, when did you realize, I guess there's sort of a turning point in the book where you realize like you had to start paying attention to these things. And the other thing is like in politics, does it become almost like addictive, the stress?
It is. Well, you're running on adrenaline, that's really, and the more stress there is, the more adrenaline there is, and the more that you can keep going. And so for me, the first time the real physical toll ever happened was when my gums were bleeding in Israel on our trip we were the first campaign to take a sitting, well, not a sitting president, a candidate. It was the summer of 2008 to the Middle East. And of course, this whole thing has helped me learn like how to listen to people and read the room, because when all of the senior staff on the campaign were like, oh, we're not just going to go to Jordan and Israel, we're going to go to Germany and the UK and France. And that was it's so much because you don't have embassy support. So you're basically doing everything yourself. And so I woke up, we had 20, I think it was like 28 events and or meetings when we were in Israel. And the morning that we were leaving, I woke up at the King David hotel and my gums were just totally bleeding. And like, you just keep going, you swish salt water and like, you just keep going. And so those kind of things would happen. But by the time I got to year 5.5, I think, in the White House, I was forgetting things, like truly forgetting things, like halfway to work and like, did I feed the cat? And would pull over and like couldn't remember if I had fed the cat. Lost my keys, couldn't find them. Like, things sound small, but then sort of towards the end, it was 2012, and it was right around when Benghazi had happened. And I was talking to David Plouffe in my office, and I was typing on the computer, and Plouffe looked at me and he said, what are you doing? I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, there are no words on the screen. And so I sat there in total silence and was convinced that I had a brain tumor. Like, I was like, this is not me. I don't forget things. I don't do this. This is insane. And so I went to the White House Medical Unit, which anyone will tell you is the #1 perk of working in the White House. And they did a gross neurological exam and found that I was basically operating at like 50% of my capacity because I hadn't been sleeping for years. So I took Ambien. For a long time, and then I took the test again, and I was like sort of back on my feet. But I realized that when you start needing like substance to keep you going, it's probably time to tap out and let somebody else have their turn to, almost fall down on the queen.
So it sounds like it wasn't really like you didn't decide to leave; you had to leave by the time you left.
Yeah, I felt it was really like my time to go, and I think that, especially these guys, this is my squad right here, I think that they'd say it's like you just start getting angry. And it's one of the things that I don't remember if I write about it in the book, but the documentary, the September issue about Vogue, Anna Wintour talks about her father and when he talked to her about deciding to leave the Evening Standard, and it was that Evening Standard. And he said it's because he had gotten angry and that he was just more angry than engaged. And I started feeling more angry, I think, than I was comfortable with.
Well, I want to ask you about like who has your job now, because I actually don't know.
Joe Hagan.
Oh, okay.
Joe Hagan has
before we do that, I just want to ask one question.
Go.
So you were you had all these experiences when you were 32 and flying around Air Force One and traveling the world with the president, and how does anything stack up to that afterwards? Like, how?
It doesn't. No, I mean, I think
a transition to doing something else.
We were literally just talking on our way over here that, work is work is work. And the White House and that experience is something so special that it's almost impossible to not be disappointed when you leave, if only because you have such purpose and such mission and such a team. And so, yeah, nothing really stacks up. But the reason that I decided to go to Vice was because when I went, and I encourage this, I say it in the book, but when you're thinking of taking a new job, you should always like really get to know the office that you might be living in. Like, for me, one thing I never thought about is that even though I was the deputy chief for operations, I still traveled so much that having an actual desk job was much harder than I thought it was going to be, because I was just like in the same place and it was kind of boring. But I went to Vice because it felt like a campaign. It was like there was hustle and bustle, and there were just big folding tables and chairs, and I felt like I can do this. I know how to navigate this environment. And I wanted to do something totally different. Like, I think that when you leave the White House, you don't have like a real sense of identity. Like, all I knew was that I'd worked for Barack Obama for like 9.5 years, and I didn't know what I was other than that. And so I thought that this was a good sort of like lever to get me into a new life.
You figured that out now?
No, I haven't. I'm still bouncing around, but I do like television, so I work at A&E.
Another one of the moments in the book that really stuck out to me, because we haven't really talked that much about your former boss,
Yes.
was when there was a story that came out, and I don't remember if it was in the Times or somewhere
Times.
else. Yeah, that sort of it denigrated. And it didn't really denigrate. I read it over.
I was
a few
very
times.
sensitive. I was very sensitive, but I took it as a denigration. I took it as an assault.
Yeah, it described Alyssa's job as sort of like someone who was just booking the president's travel, and it minimized it in a big way.
It did.
And you sort of responded to the group and let loose a little bit on email, and then in an encounter the next day with the president, he expressed some feelings about that email that
He
you
did.
sent.
So what had happened was, I forget sort of what point in history it was, but there was an article. Oh, I know what it was. We were getting a new chief of staff was coming in, and they were talking about whether at the time Nancy DeParle, who was the deputy chief for policy, and I would be kept on, and whether or not we would survive, the ascension of the new chief of staff. And someone who we still don't ever know who it was basically said, like, I would probably be safe because I handled, like, logistics for everybody. And so, like, who wants to get rid of the person that takes care of all the logistics? So I thought that was, like, absolute hot trash. And when they sent the email around, when the comms office sent the email around, I replied to everyone on the email chain. And I was like, this is an abomination. I can't believe it. I thought we're supposed to have each other's backs. But, like, it was a little bit more harsh than that. But it was not... But then my girlfriend, who was the president's lawyer, Kathy Rubmler, she doubled down. She's like, yeah, Alyssa's right. This is crazy. You guys are awful. And then I went on with my life, and I felt good that I got my feelings out. And then the next day I come into the office, and was it Fo? No, it was Anita. Said, POTUS wants to see you. And it turned out that someone on that email chain, it was actually more than one person, it was like 3 or 4, went to him and was like, Alyssa's really mad. Alyssa's really upset. And so he calls me and he's like, so I heard you sent an email. And I went stone cold, like my face just went blank. And he's like, stop trying to figure out who came to talk to me. And I was like, no, I'm going to figure it out. And he's like, stop. He's like, you need to understand your words have power. And until you realize that, like, you're going to keep doing stuff like this. But like, just don't underestimate your impact on people, and don't send crazy things that people can forward to the Washington Post. And I was like, okay.
And what did you learn from that? Like, what was,
I learned that, I think that I always look at myself as like a little less than, and that of course no one would take what I said seriously because it was just Alyssa. It's just Alyssa was pissed. And like, it turned out that I was the only person that thought that way. So I stopped thinking that way. And I don't send crazy emails anymore. At work.
So I think that I've looked at some of the stuff you've been writing and talking about
Yes.
since you've been promoting this book, and I just want to flash forward to the current administration.
Yes.
You and I'm sure we're going to open this up to a Q&A after this question, so I'm sure people can ask more Trump
Sure.
questions. But one is, like, in terms of like etiquette of the Oval Office, I saw that you weighed in on Kellyanne Conway sitting on the
Yes.
couch, and like, I want to know, like, is this a stupid distraction that we shouldn't be talking about, and you seem to think it matters? So like, what
I
what did you think of
do,
it?
and here's why. And all the people who worked with me for all these years know that I'm like super. Well, I'll mea culpa here for a second. I was on a radio interview like 2 weeks ago, and right after the Kellyanne Conway thing came out, and I said, the White House and the Oval Office is the greatest home court advantage. And I'm like, I forget what president said that. And then I remembered it was Andrew Shepard from The American President, not a real one. True story. But it's true. Pfeiffer called me out on it. I was like, I know, it's American President. But my issue, and like, I think that for all of us who were there in the very beginning when we transitioned from president-elect and the Bush administration got on board and helped us in every way possible, like, they could not have been more generous. And so when they gave us all of the protocols and how you do certain things and templates and binders, we didn't just throw them in the burn bag because they came from the Bush administration. We looked through them and we kept a lot of what they did because it worked. And so a lot of what I feel the Trump folks are doing is just shooting protocol for the sport of shooting protocol and because we at some point touched it and not because it's really bad. And the protocols aren't for really governing you, but they're to make other countries feel comfortable. Like I saw the other day, they didn't have a translator for Angela Merkel in the business leaders meeting. Like that's embarrassment for the entire country, all of us, like red, blue, whatever. And so when Kellyanne Conway was in the Oval and she was sitting on her knees, I think that my tweet of outrage was something like, I never saw Sonny or Bo sit that way in the Oval. Which is true. It's true. They didn't go on the couches. But it was more that it was less even about how she sat and more that there was a room full of HBCU presidents there. And she was sitting like a child on the couch and wasn't even interacting with them. And that's what I thought was the most shameful.
All right. Well, there's 2 mics. So people should line up at the mics and can ask Alyssa their own questions.
Step right up.
Don't make this awkward for me.
While we're waiting. Oh, here we go.
I was just curious, what could you describe what a day would be like, or like a week or something?
Sure, I can give you a day. So we had a 7:30 meeting. So we'd get to the office by in the very beginning, you'd get to the office at 6:30, and close to the end, you got there at 7:23 for the 7:30 meeting. But no, you have the 7:30 meeting in the chief of staff's office, and then there was an 8:30 meeting of an expanded senior staff group in the Roosevelt room. And then, so for example, when I was deputy chief, I had my department head meetings sort of stacked as a daily check-in. And then you could be in the situation room talking about a foreign trip or policy meetings, or you'd be out on the road with the president. And then we'd have a wrap-up meeting that was supposed to start at 5:30, which usually started at 7 or 7:30, and then you start all over again. So I make it sound like not that exciting. It's actually more exciting than that, but that's any given day. Anyone else?
So, the biggest lesson that I think the media is trying to learn from this previous election just a few months ago is that Washington is a bubble, and essentially it was popped, or at least that's the narrative that was coming out. Do you feel that the White House staff was ever out of touch with the general American populace, or what is your reaction to that?
You mean like our White House? Like Obama?
Yeah, your White House.
Oh.
How do you respond to the accusation that Washington is a bubble that's out of touch with mainstream America?
So I would say that that's probably true if you never leave Washington. And I think even though we left, we'd go on trips and stuff, I think the one thing that kept the president and all of us really in touch were the 10 letters that he would receive every night from people around the country. And it was not a rare occasion to get one of those letters put on your desk with the president saying, figure this out. I mean, and my favorite example is that someone wrote him a letter and it ended up in his folder because they didn't have a refrigerator. And they called him to ask if he could help them get a refrigerator. And guess what? If you work hard enough, you can figure out how to get someone a refrigerator. You call the Salvation Army and tell them if they get one, can they send it over? And so I think that those are not the things that we put in press releases or touted, but I would say that we were all pretty in touch with what was happening in the country and in the world.
So jumping off of that, what are some of the biggest leadership lessons that you've been able to gain from working at the White House that you've been able to apply now at your new jobs, your new career?
Sure. I think that I speak up a lot more, and I think that people want to. When I was in the White House, I would say that I largely would not want to speak unless I knew I was right. And I wouldn't just offer an opinion of how I felt or what I thought. And so I don't do that anymore. I say whatever is on my mind. And I think that it's people around you see it and then they echo it and they feel confident that they can do it too. And so it just changes the conversation in the room. So that's what
So many questions, starting from where did you get your glasses? But you can tell me that later.
They're from Soho. They're a company called Cutler and Ross, I think. Gross, Cutler and Gross. Thanks, Audrey.
Noted. Real question though. Big fan of Vice, so I have so many questions, but I'm gonna get the one question I guess I could ask.
Sure.
what do you think is your accomplishment in the White House that you're most proud of? Like, even if it's not big or known, but what are you what's like the best thing that you think you did?
The best thing. I know. I mean, the tampons are pretty big. I would say my biggest accomplishment, if this may not be the answer you're looking for, but it's what I'm going to tell you, is that when we got to the White House, we were all kids, for the most part. Like, we were kids. And I called these guys the kids, and they're like, not kids anymore. But I think that what I was most proud of is that in my time there, I saw all of the people who had sort of come when I asked them to come back in January of 2007, and who really sort of put a wager on me, and they left over my time when I was there and became chiefs of protocol and went off to run companies, and I was really proud of that. And I have a drawer of about 300 thank you letters that people wrote me when they would leave the White House to say, thank you for having an open door and talking to me. And so those are the two things I'm most proud of.
That's great.
Not what you expected.
Yes, hi, ma'am.
Yes,
Over
hi,
here.
hi.
Yes, hi. So I really liked the anecdote that you gave earlier about Obama telling you that words really matter, especially because it seems like today words don't really matter much anymore.
Right.
So I want to kind of know, when you guys were in Obama's staff, did you keep him in check constantly? And is that failing to happen nowadays?
I mean, I would say that we did not require the level of checks and balances that probably should be installed now. But no, he's a POTUS. I say POTUS, you know who I'm talking about. He's super measured and really thoughtful, so that was never really, it was more us. We'd want to be like, we're going to go cut that senator. We can't believe they did that. And he'd be like, stop it. Sit down, Alyssa. Just stop. So no, if anything, he had to keep us in check.
Okay. Thank you.
You know who I'm talking about. Yes, hi.
Hi. So you mentioned the tampon things, but were there other areas where you felt like women were overlooked or weren't as heard, and how did you navigate that?
So, not as much. I think that we realized a couple months in that there wasn't, or maybe it was like a year in, that there wasn't a lactation room for women or reporters who were in the White House press corps if they were nursing and had to go to a bathroom. And so we resolved that pretty quickly for everybody to be able to use. But other than that, I don't really know.
Thank you.
Sorry.
So my question's more about being a young person at the White House. I know sometimes it can be a struggle in Washington to get folks who've been around the block a few times to take you pretty seriously. And I remember you kind of told an anecdote about that on a podcast recently.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what you recommend for young men and young women to get folks in their office to take their ideas and their words seriously.
I think one is acting like a serious person. I mean, you always have to, and that's hard for me because, as you can tell, I'm not super serious. But for us, we came in, and the story that you're referencing was when I was talking to Favreau and Pfeiffer about Bob Gates and how he felt about some of the people that he was forced to interact with, which I think he referred to as kids. And the thing is, look, in retrospect, he's probably not wrong. If I was Bob Gates and had been in 5 administrations and had to deal with us, I'd have been like, how did this happen? But I would say that I just tried to be the very best at my job, and I didn't try to do anybody else's job. And it didn't take that long before people were like, oh, if Alyssa's saying this, then this is probably what it is. And I would say it wasn't just me, it was everyone that I worked with in my department. People were like, oh, they might look like they just fell out of Dawson's Creek, but they actually know what they're talking about. So I would say just be as confident as you can. And I always tried to have all of my facts sort of lined up so that if people tried to shoot me down, I could shoot them back. Hi.
Hi. I was very interested by your comments about preparing yourself before you went on the road and when you expected to be at state dinners or formal occasions and so forth, and that the President and First Lady wanted you and the other staff to be engaging with your counterparts and so forth, and that you felt at least that that meant being at least reasonably knowledgeable about the country or the situation. And but I can imagine that could go awry if you had too much to say about policy or things that were relevant in there. And so the question is, were you cautioned or even instructed what not to say or what topics not to deal with, or
I think
was that left entirely to you and your judgment?
I mean, I would say that through the course of trip planning, you sort of learn what the hot button issues are, and you avoid them. Mostly, I just tried to be super pleasant. And I don't know if this story made it in the book, but when we were in China, our first visit to China, to just give you a sense of the things I would do, I was between the Chinese transportation secretary and I think the tourism minister, and I asked them, what's your favorite American song? And they said, "We Are the World." And so we played a game where we tried to name everyone who was in the song. And so we make it all the way through, and like the third course comes and people are drinking coffee, and all of a sudden the transportation secretary to my side yells out, he said, "Cyndi Lauper, we forgot Cyndi Lauper." And Robert Gibbs, the press secretary, and Larry Summers, who was NEC director at the time, both looked at me like, "What are you doing over there? Like, what are you talking about Cyndi Lauper for?" And I was like, "I got this, it's fine." So I tried to keep it pretty light, and I didn't try to go into too much policy because that's not really my area of expertise, so I avoided it at all costs. Thanks.
I thoroughly enjoyed your book. It
Thank
was
you.
just smart and funny and informative, and it had so much heart, which really came across. I'm
Great.
very curious about what you're doing now and why you selected whatever it is that you're doing now.
Oh, well, so now I'm the president of global communication strategy and talent at A&E. And so that's History, the History Network, Lifetime, A&E, FYI, and Viceland. And the reason I ended up at A&E is because Viceland had a joint venture, Vice had a joint venture with A&E, which was Viceland. And one of the things that I felt coming out of the election was that the History brand and Lifetime brand could be two of the most important things happening on television if it was really invested, because I think that women need a community and someplace to go, and History, I think, could be a real destination in the world of fake news for, if you really were to make it even bigger than it is. And so that's why I switched over from Vice to A&E, because I felt really passionately about that. Thanks.
The White House had several events to encourage young people, and particularly males, to get into the Affordable Care Act. And you had several events there to try to do that job. A coworker of mine at OPM and another guy, we decided to watch ESPN to see how many commercials there were that arose out of that effort. And there were very, very few. Do you have any take on those events and how things could have been done better? Because it's still an issue that continues to be deviled.
Well, one of the best parts of working in the White House is that we had a pretty bright line between policy and operations. So healthcare was almost always exclusively handled by the deputy chief for policy, which would have been Rob Neighbors or Nancy Andeparle. But, I would say it probably would have been good if the website worked. That would have helped.
After a while.
But no, so I don't really know. I don't know that much about that. Hi.
Hi. One of the criticisms of President Obama was that he didn't work on his relationships enough with the Hill, and he wasn't, his buddy. And, obviously that contrasts with the president in the book. Could you kind of talk about, in hindsight, how you look at that? And
was he actually... So I'll tell you that in my opinion, he was criticized for things that were just garbage, because he did have relationships with people, with the Democrats. But to remember... Mitch McConnell said when the day we were being inaugurated that his number one objective was to make sure Barack Obama didn't get reelected. And so, a lot of what they're talking about is the, bipartisanship and how it's worse now than it was before we got here. But he did reach out to people, and he did it, in my opinion, in a much more thoughtful and sincere way, and didn't just do this sort of grandstand, take people out to play golf and show them that they're talking. He wrote notes and made phone calls, and people came over, but it wasn't showy.
going to jump in here. You can go first.
This past week, there was a photo in the Washington Post and I think the New York Times,
Mm-hmm.
and it showed the new president speaking with many of his cabinet members around a table with a lot of lack of diversity.
Mm-hmm. That photo was crazy.
Yeah. And kind of segueing into a little bit of arts, it all depends on if you're in the room when it happens.
Mm-hmm.
What happens when women, diversity is not in the room, from your experience being a woman with a different view?
So I will say that we definitely had our share of policy meetings in the White House where some dudes had outsized opinions on what should happen with birth control or Planned Parenthood. And that's when, like, even if I'm not a policy expert, I know I speak from a place of truth and knowledge. And so it's like any company or corporation, if women and diverse people see themselves in leadership, they want to be there. And so if you don't, it's like that table, the picture of that table begets more pictures in meetings that are just like that table. So
can I pop in here with an Obama question? Mm-hmm. I'm assuming you're still close with them, and they're here in the city, and Trump is spending most of his time talking about Obama wiretapping Trump Tower during the election based on no evidence. How do the Obamas see their role and when they should weigh in, and how they should not weigh in?
I would say, and I'm not speaking for them, this is my opinion, I would say that, in the same way that President Bush sat back when we took office and sort of let us do our thing, I think that that's what they're doing, because you don't want to be the former president who's like litigating. Well, one, it's super diminishing, and second, you're not president anymore. So I think that he is sort of hanging out, but I think that we will see a lot of him in 2018, hopefully. So yeah. Hello, Helen.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Great. This is amazing. Thank you for being here. Awesome. So my question is, obviously one of the most upsetting parts about the presidency so far has been the normalization of a lot of things. And I think in particular Ivanka Trump's role and people rushing to call her a feminist, which is hilarious. And
here.
Just gonna be honest. So I'm curious what you think about that in particular, just like generally the normalization, including Democrats who are doing that, frankly. And then also kind of Ivanka Trump and this like BS brand of feminism that she's promoting. So
here's how I feel. You can't dip your toe in and dip your toe out, right? Either you're like gonna be like, when they were talking about her, which I actually couldn't figure out legally how her deal is structured to be in the White House, that was my job, and I don't know how it could possibly be. But working in the White House isn't a hobby. It's not something you show up for when you feel like it. It's carrying things from day to day. And, I think that one of the things about Ivanka is that she is an entrepreneur. And entrepreneurs know that you need truth in advertising. And a month ago, all she was doing was selling her accessories in Macy's. And now suddenly she's doing women's empowerment in the West Wing. So, believe it when I see it.
Thank you.
Hi, so you work in television now, and there's clearly a lot of shows that have been made that try to show what it's like working in the White House, often comedies. Which show would you say is the most accurate and the least accurate?
So the most accurate, I've got to go with Veep. Right? And the least accurate is probably Scandal, but it's so interesting that you have to watch. But true story, when Scandal came on, Danielle and I were texting, and I was like, "Are you watching?" She's like, "Yes, I'm watching." And then I'm like, "Can you believe that he just said to get Olivia on a secure line when Olivia was on a cell phone?" And Danielle's husband was like, "If you two are going to do this, you have to stop watching, because I'm not going to listen to this for another couple of years." But so that's the most that does not happen. I could not imagine David Axelrod having people assassinated. Or killing them himself. So, but it is entertaining and it's fun.
Thank you.
You bet.
So I have one more question for
ma'am.
you. So you're working at A&E in an executive role, which is amazing. A lot of people after working in government go to a political consulting firm or start one of their own, and you're now in a sort of politically adjacent role. Do you miss politics? This is a three-part question. Do you
Okay,
miss
so
politics?
yes, I totally miss it.
Part two.
Yeah.
Do you think you could do another presidential campaign?
So, yes, probably. But here's why. Because I've never worked for anyone that I didn't totally believe in, and I've always been motivated more by character and personality than sort of like proximity to power. So if I could genuinely be helpful and not just like a sad hanger-on that's like, oh, we better include Alyssa in the conference call, then I would probably, if it was someone I really cared about, I would totally do it.
And would you ever run for office yourself?
No, never.
And why?
I just can't. I don't want to look at myself on TV.
So who are some names that might interest you in 4 years?
My list. So I love Kirsten Gillibrand. Just at the Wing a few weeks ago. Love Elizabeth Warren, but like think that we really need her in the Senate. Kamala, of course, Kamala Harris. That's probably it. Those are the people I follow on Twitter. Well, here's the thing. Love Bernie. Today is actually, where did I see it? Today's the anniversary of the Birdie Bernie picture. I think that the future of the party probably needs to be like a little younger. I don't mean it, and that's terrible because I have felt ageism, and I love him, but it's like, we need someone who can really.
Did you vote for Bernie in the primary?
What the fuck, dude? I'm not saying who I voted for. That was. No, I'm not saying anything because I love them both. Love them both.
So I was saying to you, oh, sorry, go ahead. Go for it.
Hi.
Hi.
I just had a question about the president's the scheduling.
Mm-hmm.
How long does it take to get a schedule approved for just one day, and how hard is it to keep him to that schedule?
So it's pretty easy to keep him to the schedule because let me put it this way. If people from out of town were coming in to meet with him, he never ever wanted to keep them waiting. Because if people have traveled, even when we had like terrible snow events, he was like, well, are we really going to cancel? Like, people have flown in for this. So now on days that were all internal meetings, like, did sometimes he just want to choose his own adventure? Totally. And sometimes he did. But in terms of getting things approved, I feel like we had a really good operation, and it wasn't that bad. It was, you knew what the priorities were, you met with the people you need to meet with, and you just went. He certainly didn't want to approve, he didn't approve his daily schedules or anything like that. We did it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So I know in the current political climate, there are a whole lot of, raging war on the media. And so I was just curious, during your administration, what media outlet you felt like was the most true and honest to what you felt like was going on in the White House at the time?
Well, as Annie Karni from Politico just said, Politico. They always had the best leaks. They did. I actually did. I felt the New York Times, I always felt was pretty accurate, and actually Politico also. It's true. Glenn Thrush is awesome.
And seeing what's going on right now, do you still feel like that's the truth with what's going on?
I do. I'll tell you that for the first time in a lot of years, I got a New York Times subscription, and the one thing that I tell people when they're like, we were at the Girl Boss conference a couple weeks ago, and they were like, what can we do? And I say, I just feel like right now we have to be smarter than we've ever been before. And I know, speaking personally, one of the stories that's in the book is that I did debate prep with Chuck Schumer. And his chief of staff called me and said, Alyssa, we'd really love it if you could help out and play Wendy Long. And I was like, who is Wendy Long? And they're like, Chuck's opponent. I live in New York, and I didn't even know who was running against Chuck. So I'm not casting anything on anyone. Like, this is all of us. But I try now to, instead of trying to find 30 versions of the same story on Twitter, I try to read, from front to back, so I know a lot of different things and not just the 7 different ways Paul Ryan's statement was paraphrased.
Thank you.
So I was saying to you, backstage in the green
room
in Lissa's office, that 10, 15 years ago when I was about to go to college and was my whole dream was to go work in politics, I would have been so obsessed with this book. Like, I would have read this, like, earmarked in a million different ways and stalked you and like everything else under the sun. So I have another two-part question. The first is, other than who thought this was a good idea, do you have another book that you would recommend young people, and especially young women who want to go into politics, should read?
Oh, wow.
You can tweet it later.
Yeah, I'm going to have to tweet it later because here's the truth, I don't read that many books because I've spent too much time on Twitter. It's all part of like my new resolution. But no, I'd have to think about it.
Okay. And then the second was, as a sort of, as somebody who is really looked up to by a lot of people who are in college, about to go out and, pursue a career in government, in the opposition party, whatever it is, what would be sort of the biggest piece of advice that you would leave them with?
So the biggest piece of advice I would leave them with is sort of like figure out what your North Star is, like what you really want to do, if you know what it is, and just know that like just keep tracking in the right direction. It doesn't have to be in a straight line, and if something doesn't work out, it doesn't mean that the dream is dead. Like I certainly thought that. But yeah, just be as open-minded as you can be, because I feel like I was open-minded and a lot of opportunities came my way that if I had said, my dream is that I am going to work in the White House by 32, I definitely would have made all the wrong decisions trying to get there. So I would just say be really open-minded.
We are going to have time for one more question. I just want to remind everybody, we have books up front, and the signing line will take here. And if you don't mind folding up your chairs, that would be awesome. And you have the final question.
Well, it's going to be quick, and it's not going to be a question. I wanted to, sorry. Cool. This has been terrific. It's so much fun listening to you.
Oh, thank you.
It's really great. I bought your book, and I can't wait to read it.
Excellent. Yeah. I hope you enjoy it. I hope it doesn't disappoint.
Actually, I guess I sort of do have a question. to introduce the thing I'm really sort of afraid to say in this particular setting, but did you ever come across a political journalist named Matt Taibbi? Taibbi?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to give a pitch for his book as well as your book.
Oh, that's fine.
I mean, his
ahead.
book is unbelievable, and I'm afraid people may not buy it because it's called Insane Clown President. And they might just think it's silly, or it's not that. Well, actually, I was very drawn to it, but it's you might not think it's serious, but it's brilliant in explaining what happened.
Well, that's very helpful, and we will get the book.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
And her book.
And my book. And my book.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.